The girl was drowning in the water. Her big eyes were wide open in terror. She felt the cold water burn her skin and screamed frantically not to do this. Heather's father tried to reach her, who was pensive. His daughter seemed pale to him and he insisted on postponing the ceremony. The girl refused, saying she had just had a nightmare that night. The loving father held his daughter by the hand and led her to the hall. The path along which the bride walked was exquisitely decorated with flowers. Everything looked luxurious and festive. When the large doors opened, the banquet hall was filled with beautiful music, as if announcing the beginning of the wedding ceremony. The priest announced to everyone present the exit of the bride, Heather Greta. The bride looked luxurious. The place where she got to and walked along the red carpet seemed very long to her. She looked with sadness on her face at her fiancé who was waiting for her at the altar. A tall brunette in an elegant suit with gold fringe on his shoulders. As the girl looked at the manly face with the big blue eyes, the lump in her throat disappeared. She wanted to know if it was all real or just a dream. The groom took her hand and led her to the priest. The ladies discussed what a wonderful couple the newlyweds looked like. Friends and relatives wished them happiness and a wonderful life together. The pastor announced the beginning of the vow ceremony. Cassian Eckerd and Heather Greta vowed to love and respect each other for the rest of their lives. The boy promised right away. He asked the thoughtful girl if she would never look at him. The priest asked her to concentrate, and asked the bride again. Finally, she made a promise. After that, the pastor told the groom and the bride to exchange wedding rings. Cassian put the wedding ring on the girl's fragile hand. She thought it was because he was as reserved and kind as usual. After exchanging wedding rings, the priest solemnly pronounced them husband and wife. He insisted on a vow kiss in front of everyone. The groom looked at the girl with loving eyes. His thick black hair fell over his eyes. In a gentle voice, he confessed his love to Heather, put his arm around her neck and kissed her. The girl didn't understand why his lips seemed so warm. She plunged into a passionate and ardent kiss. When she finally made sure that it wasn't a dream and everything was real. After all, Heather really did marry him. At the estate, the assistants gathered to gossip. They guessed that Raiden was going to propose to the girl. They didn't like him, and it was unlikely that he would ask for her hand in marriage. The senior assistant knew that unscrupulous boy. Didn't they know that his father had taken all the property from the count and was surprised that the girls didn't know? It had long been known that he was using the count's debt as a weapon to blackmail the young lady. The poor girl had to deal with a scoundrel. The lady was supposed to marry that damned cousin. And only now did they feel sorry for the little girl. The cocky young man came to talk to the lady. He hoped she knew the reason for his visit. After all, if the girl marries him, she can forget about her father's debts and live in luxury. Raiden behaved defiantly and laughed. The blonde lady flatly refused. The boy growled like a beast in anger. He reminded Heather of her age, and having refused marriage, she will remain alone. He was surprised that the lady thought she was still beautiful. The desperate girl sat and drank tea calmly. She called it the worst proposal ever. Heather asked for only one thing, not to get angry and not to argue. He was the son of an uncle who had his entire estate stolen out of hatred when his father failed to inherit the title. Raiden was a clear and dissolute man. Time passed and they talked some more. Heather asked for some time to think. She assured him that she was not interested in wealth. After all, marriage is a serious matter. The confused girl was interrupted by the impudent Raiden. He didn't care how much she had to think. After all, she was going to marry him anyway. The agitated lady did not want to be in the same room with him. She bowed and left. Heather was born the daughter of an earl and knew she would soon be married. She never imagined a lavish wedding with the perfect partner. She was to marry someone who feared the strong and insulted the weak. The lady hated her life. The father was seething with anger. That bastard wanted to marry his daughter. The brother tried to calm the agitated Heather. He wanted to go to Raiden and ask him to soften the offer. His father couldn't figure out how to do it. Cedric wanted to talk first, but if talking didn't work, he would try another way. The men had already decided to leave. Heather tried to stop them. In her opinion, they both needed time to calm down. Her father and brother were good people. They would try to beat the offer somehow. Heather knew that only retaliation would come back anyway. Of course she didn't want to marry the brash and cruel Raiden. And no matter how much she thought about it, there was no reason to refuse. She would marry him before the world turned upside down. Confused, Heather couldn't bring herself to cause trouble for her family. The girl made her decision and told her father and brother about it. Heather agreed to the wedding and asked them not to worry. She would take care of everything. Suddenly their conversation was interrupted by the assistant. He announced the visit of Mr. Ryden. The father was beyond his wits and went to deal with him. Her daughter tried to stop him. Heather was unhappy why he had come now. It was pouring outside the window. Ryden was already in the hallway. He had come to get an answer to his proposal. He didn't like that no one took his request seriously. The guy threatened the girl that he would break her, and she would only obey him. Heather's father's menacing voice echoed throughout the estate. He grabbed the boy by the shirt. The angry man insisted on repeating what he had said. He shouted that no one, especially Ryden, dared to hurt his daughter. But the adamant boy said that he would marry his daughter. Ryden did not like the harsh hospitality. But his father was categorical about the marriage. He had not cared for his daughter for so many years for that. And then marry her off to such a cretin. Ryden asked the count not to go that far. He doubted that anyone else would want to marry his daughter. Heather couldn't bear to watch or listen to this anymore. Did they really think she would die before she disgraced her family? Ryden called the girl's father's behavior rude. Cedric couldn't stand it and hit the guy in the face. He threatened if he didn't stop insulting his family. Then it wouldn't be enough with just one punch. Ryden started calling the men names. After all, no one dared to hit him. He grabbed Cedric's clothes with both hands. The girl could not stand it and called their behavior childish. She wanted to stop them so that no one would hurt anyone else. After all, it could have bad consequences. The commotion was interrupted by a message from the assistant. She announced a guest. Heather had no idea who it could be. She saw a gray-haired and stocky man. He apologized and wanted to meet Heather Aretha. The lady asked the reason for his visit. He apologized again and introduced himself as Gillian Oswell, butler to the Duke of Eckards. The man said that it had originally been intended that the Duke would come in person, but due to unforeseen circumstances, the butler had to come. Heather was stunned and stood as if rooted to the spot. Gilliam held a letter in his hand. It was a message from His Majesty the Duke. He unfolded it and began to read. The Duke was proposing to dear Heather to marry him. Her father and brother were as stunned by the news as the fair-haired girl. Duke Eckhard's butler arrived in a luxurious, gleaming carriage. A servant followed him, holding a box of jewelry in his hands. It was an exquisite necklace decorated with moonstone and diamonds. It was so rare that if it were sold, it would last a lifetime. This was also a gift from Duke Eckhart. It was shrouded in a veil of rumor and gossip. When Gilliam read the letter, his father and Cedric could not understand what it was. This news was also heard by Ryden. He did not expect the lady to have time to see the Duke. His brother could not help but want to hit him again. But the butler forbade it. Gilliam wanted the braggart to answer for his words towards Lady Heather. He didn't understand what was wanted of him. Ryden called them all strange and didn't want any more weddings. The offended ignoramus turned and left. The butler emphasized that the lady was not obliged to answer immediately. The Duke would remain in the capital and they would wait for an answer. When the girl decided, she should have told him. The gallant man put on his hat and said goodbye to Heather. She and her family discussed the situation all night. Her father asked if his daughter had ever seen the Duke. The poor girl didn't even know what he looked like, and she understood his excitement. After all, the Duke was so famous that no one in the empire knew about him. His family was said to have been the founders of the country and ruled the eastern part of the empire. After their death, their youngest son inherited the title. The current Duke was not from the East. A family that did not show its face was in any case a good topic for rumors. At receptions, everyone gossiped about the Duke's death. But it was his father, and that Eckhart was a monster. His fame had faded and left behind only empty talk. Cedric couldn't understand why the Duke had made the proposal. He was against it because he was a bad man. Besides, the East is a closed and rather unusual place. Her brother was afraid to send Heather alone. The father also doubted Eckhard's good intentions. He didn't like it very much. And he wasn't sure about marriage. The girl felt tense. She reminded the men of Ryden's proposal. The girl did not want her family to be ridiculed. He needed a good reason to refuse. If the lady accepted the Duke's offer, Ryden would have to back down. Heather didn't know the reasons for the Duke's proposal, but it was a good reason to reject Ryden's marriage. The girl was ready to accept it. Her father refused to do this for the sake of the family. After all, it was no different from selling. Cedric supported his father's opinion. The guy emphasized that it only takes time to repay the debt, and the sister should not sacrifice herself. She deserves better. The girl saw the only way to save her family. Heather asked her father not to blame himself. Then she hugged him tightly. Father emphasized that everything should be thought through carefully. The confused lady had already accepted the offer, and he knew that she would not change her mind. A month later, the butler visited Agreta's estate. The lady met him and said she had been waiting for him. Gilliam was also happy to meet him. He apologized again for the Duke's absence and politely told him to contact him with any questions. Heather wasn't surprised. It was just that they were supposed to discuss the marriage in detail today. They were sitting in the bright guest room drinking tea. The butler informed her that the Duke would cover all the expenses of the wedding. Her family did not have to contribute anything. The Duke also agreed to pay off their debt. Heather refused, explaining that her family did not want to sell her. Gilliam agreed with the lady and asked if she had any more questions. Heather, excited, wanted to know why the Duke had proposed to her. But the man himself did not know this. The lady had no more questions and he had to send a servant to help. Heather was grateful for the trouble. Before leaving, Gilliam emphasized that if the brat he saw bothered her, she should let him know and he should deal with it. Heather assured her that everything was fine. The poor thing decided to accept the Duke's offer to reject the other one. The Duke's carriage arrived and preparations for the long journey began. The assistants gathered the young lady's things and took care not to forget anything. In the blooming garden, father and brother said goodbye to Heather. They warned her that it would be cold outside. Lady should dress warmly and not get sick. Her excited brother warned her that if something didn't work out, they would be waiting for her at any time. A smiling Heather was also worried about her boys. Gina's assistant was already waiting for the lady. They got into the carriage and Hazel assured her loved ones that everything would be fine. The carriage set off. The sun was setting as they continued on their journey. The assistant was worried if the Duke was really a monster. Heather reassured her because it was just gossip. She held Gina's hand. The lady was not familiar with the Duke and did not know the East. But she believed that everything would be fine. Heather was determined to protect her family. The carriage gradually took Heather further and further from her home. Soon they left the capital, the place where the lady had grown up. After a month and a half they arrived. Gina was excited as they drove through the east gate. Everything around was in thick fog. The assistant asked if they would be there today. Heather was told that today was the last stop. The assistant was worried because it was her first time in the east of the empire. Lady looked around the area and liked it. The weather was cool, so she had to dress warmly. Heather was surprised by the locals. She couldn't understand why all the people were raising their hands to the mountain and greeting the dawn. Maybe they were celebrating something. The assistant started combing the lady's hair. They should be there soon. Gina asked what was happening outside the window. The people seemed very happy to the lady, as if they were on a holiday. The maid finished cleaning the lady and they were told that they were almost there. Confused, Heather couldn't believe that she would soon see the place where a new life would begin. They arrived at Eckhard's huge estate. Together with the dazzling sun, the butler met them. The lady hurried to ask about the unusual thing she had seen. In the morning, she was surprised by the dancing of the inhabitants and the joy of the sunrise. Gilliam explained to the inquisitive lady that a bright sunrise in these parts was a rarity. He added that it was the first time he had seen the sun in this area. Heather, stunned, remembered the cottage she had lived in, which had always been beautiful. She had never imagined that they would be happy at dawn. It was part of her daily routine, while for others it was a real miracle. The great doors of the mansion opened. They were greeted by a crowd of assistants. One of the assistants hurried to help with the things. Heather thanked her and asked where she could find the Duke. But he was busy with business in the city. This did not bring any relief to the lady. The confused girl needed time to get used to it. She tried to find the good sides. She saw a dried-up garden, cobwebs everywhere, and nothing. Heather was in despair because she couldn't find any positives. Everything needs to be put in order, or better yet, demolished and rebuilt. Suddenly, Gilliam called her over. He suggested they have tea before showing the lady her chambers. The tea had an unusual taste that the girl had never tasted before. Over tea, the butler wanted to tell her something important. He began with the peculiarities of life in the East. Outside the estate, it was necessary to go with no less than 5 guards. The East was known for its crime. Gilliam shared that even the Duke is concerned about his safety. He also advised against walking around the grounds at night. It was safest to stay in the room. Due to lack of pay, there were few guards. And since sunny weather is rare, showers and fog often prevail. Heavy rains are flooding parts of the area. The lady was surprised by the abundance of rain, but the butler reassured her that she was completely safe on the estate. As for his lordship, he was so busy that he hardly ever showed up at home. The girl now knew why people sought to earn money in the East. She was worried about whether she would be able to meet him. The butler reassured her that there was no doubt about it. The Duke seemed to Heather to be a rather mysterious figure. He didn't directly manage the estate, which was why it was so neglected, and yet her room was done very gently and with love. The butler explained that it was difficult to do repairs because of the climate, and besides, the Duke had little time to take care of the estate. The lady thought it would be nice if the ruined garden was taken care of as well as the room. She was tired and lay down to rest. Maybe they would meet for dinner together. The girl fell asleep soundly. It was very dark when Heather woke up. She didn't want to sleep for so long. Suddenly, in the complete silence, someone's footsteps were heard. The lady was frightened and picked up the candlestick. She asked who it was. A man's voice was heard. He apologized for waking her. Gilliam said the lady was safe in her room. So who could have come in at such a late hour? Perhaps his lordship. Under the dim moonlight, the silhouette of a tall, strong man stood out. Heather called out to His Highness. He listened to her. Was it really him? Heather introduced herself politely. The room was very dark and she wanted to light a candle. The Duke objected. Was he really that scary? The girl tried to talk to him, at least in the dark. She was interested in why he wanted to marry her. He was silent. The lady did not mean that he did not want it. Then why did he not answer for a long time? An angry Heather couldn't bear to see his face and not know the answers to her questions. She asked for an answer to at least something. The lady was worried that she might not be treated well. Finally, he answered. Then she asked about the Duchess's authority in these lands. She was beginning to get angry. The Duke assured her that only he had great power. Heather told her about her plans to arrange the estate. His manners were irritating. He approved of her decision and was about to leave. What angered the lady most was that he did not want to speak to his future wife. In the quiet darkness, the door creaked as the Duke came out. The girl could not understand the reason for the engagement. She tried not to be upset. Now she would have plenty of time to put things in order. And she wanted to start by reorganizing the garden. Heather lit the candles in the room and was surprised. There was a bowl of soup on the table. The confused lady didn't understand where it came from. It seemed like Gina hadn't been there. The morning was bright and sunny. Heather was ready to get to work when she noticed a purple scale on the floor. Is it really that bad at cleaning? When the girl went out into the wide corridor, she saw a lot of dust on the windows. A lot of things in this mansion needed repair. Heather didn't know whether to be happy about the amount of work. She heard voices at the other end of the hall. Was it possible that the assistants were avoiding her? But she had noticed this behavior many times before. In such beautiful weather, nothing could upset the lady, and she headed towards the sounds. And as always at such moments, something bad happens. The Duke's assistants discussed the ladies. Gina tried to protect her lady. They called it a lady sold to a duke. A girl who had been banished from the capital was worthless in the East. Gina began to cry. The girls emphasized that the assistant should know her place, because she is not at home. And if she came from the capital, then she should not think that she is worth anything. The assistants threatened to show the rules of the East. Suddenly, Heather interrupted their conversation. The assistants assured her that this did not require her attention. Lady understood that she would not be respected in these parts, but she did not expect it to come to this. Angry Heather took her Gina by the hand. She emphasized in a stern voice that this was her assistant, and they had no right to treat her person like this. She hoped that this would never happen again. Heather remembered her father's teaching. Always treat these people with respect, but that didn't mean tolerating insults. You need to respect others but preserve your dignity. According to her father, she should not turn a blind eye to insults directed at her. Lady gathered courage and began her educational work. Heather reminded them that she would soon be a duchess, and even now she had every right to make a remark. If they didn't like her, they could tell her anything to her face. The lady was willing to listen to anyone. Heather took her assistant out into the hallway to calm her down. She insisted that Jenna tell her about it. The lady had sent her assistant to rest, and she herself planned to work in the garden. Suddenly she saw Gilliam. They were glad to see each other. The butler had just wanted to talk to Heather and invited her into the drawing room for tea. While Gilliam poured the tea, the lady confessed that she had scolded the Duke's maid. Heather worried that she had gone too far. The butler was completely in agreement with the lady's action. After all, she would soon become their mistress. Unfortunately, they did not yet have a code of etiquette for themselves. He assured her that if it happened again, the girl had every right to reprimand them. Heather calmly began to drink the tea, which turned out to be not very tasty. The girl wanted to talk about the date of the wedding ceremony. Gilliam did not immediately answer. Then he apologized and said that there would be no ceremony. Heather was stunned by what she heard. Gilliam said that all that was needed was to sign the contract, but there would be no wedding. Lady was surprised that no one had told her about this. In the Burnick Empire, a wedding was a special event. It didn't matter if you were poor or rich, but a wedding ceremony was a must. So couples who didn't have a wedding were not considered newlyweds. The lady also expected to hold a ceremony, and she agreed to be engaged to the Duke without having a clue who he was, and all in order to refuse Raiden. Heather hoped that she could find a common language with the Duke, but there was no way back. The sad lady thought that he did not want to marry her. The girl asked the butler to bring the contract. She was curious whether after signing it she would become a duchess. The butler explained the signing procedure. The contract would come into effect after the Duke signed it. Only then would they hand over the contract to the palace. The lady was now ready to take care of the garden. She asked for all the servants to be called, for the Duke had given permission to do all this. Gilliam was surprised to see them. Heather said she had seen His Highness and it was very dark. She couldn't see him and he was very quiet. The assistants were already gathered in the hall on the first floor. They couldn't understand the reason why they had all been gathered together. There was a clatter of heels. A lady greeted them from the second floor. She introduced herself as the future Duchess of Eckerd. She also reported on the reconstruction of the garden and asked for help. From the crowd of servants, a gardener spoke up. This made the lady laugh, thinking that there was a gardener in a ruined garden. She asked for more. The sun was shining brightly in the yard. Of all the helpers, only 5 decided to help. The servants were happy for the second day in a row with good weather. Heather still couldn't believe that the sun was so rare here. She decided to tell them about the work. Today they had to remove dry bushes and weeds. Heather started rolling up her sleeves. One of the assistants was surprised that the lady would also be working. The lady assured her that it would be faster together. The work was in full swing and everyone was working hard. Heather liked that everything was going smoothly. It would probably be worth a rest. The lady asked Gina to tell the others about the break. She wanted to bring something to eat. The assistant wanted to do it herself. Heather assured her that everything was fine. She just wanted to explore the estate thoroughly. Passing the dining room, she found the kitchen. There was no one to be seen or heard. She tried to call out, but there was silence. When the lady turned around, she suddenly came across a stocky guy. In life, a person needs 3 things: clothes, blood, and food. A strange, fishy smell wafted from the kitchen, and the lady didn't seem to mind. The guy made and served the sandwich he was talking about. It was a fish sandwich. At first glance, Heather thought it was inedible. The angry girl would never eat that, no matter how hungry she was. She asked to use the kitchen and make her favorite sandwich. The guy was frowning because the lady hadn't even tasted it. After all, everyone was praising his cooking. The lady had no doubt that it was delicious. She just wanted to cook something more familiar to her. She saw that there were many varieties of fish and seafood in the kitchen. The cook said that few traders came to the east, so they had to eat local products. Not far from them was a river with a lot of fish. Now Heather understood the strange taste of that soup. They catch their own fish and eat it. The lady continued cooking. Heather made sandwiches and invited the young man to try them. He hesitated between curiosity and pride, but he tried them anyway and he really liked them. He was surprised how the lady prepared it and asked for more recipes. The girl was shocked by his reaction. She had to go and promised to tell me soon. The garden helpers also enjoyed it very much. They didn't know that such delicious food could be made without fish. It seemed to Jenny that those people had eaten nothing but fish all their lives. Heather was pleased to have won the favor of the assistants with her snack. She promised to save them from the boring fish food. The sun was setting behind the horizon. The tired lady simply fell onto the bed. She had no strength after work. The lady had not expected that the assistants would agree to help. Now the garden renovation would be finished sooner than she had expected. Heather had already finished drawing the design of the entire garden. Now her main problem was the Duke, who never wanted to show himself. Suddenly she felt something prickling on her hands. When she examined them, they were covered in scratches. But the girl was not upset by this. A bright moon was visible in the sky, illuminating everything around. Heather's sleep was interrupted by thirst and she woke up. The lady did not notice when she fell asleep. In the dark room, she saw someone's figure. Someone had come so late again. Could it be the Duke again? The girl couldn't see anything and wanted to light a candle. But she remembered from the last meeting that she shouldn't have done that. The confused lady asked why he had come. But he remained silent. She said that she had signed a marriage contract. Now all he had to do was sign it and they would be married. She imagined that wherever she went, Duchess Eckerd would be spoken of instead of her name. And yet she had not yet seen her husband's face. Even if he was actually as ugly as they gossiped about him, Heather had promised herself that she would accept him no matter who he was. She asked him to show himself to her. The Duke said it was not yet time. The angry lady thought that if he didn't show his face, it means he didn't want to talk to her. He hid, didn't talk, and didn't want the wedding either. The girl got out of bed barefoot and started walking toward him. And she didn't understand why he came to her every night. After all, it was he who proposed to her. Then why did he behave like this? The Duke ordered her to stop and not come closer, but she was already there. The Duke, frightened, pushed Heather away so that she wouldn't see him. The girl was confused, not understanding what had happened. His Highness turned abruptly and walked away. Heather froze in place. She considered what she had seen. Suddenly, the lady saw a jar on the table. There was nothing there before. When she opened it, she smelled the aroma of a healing ointment. The next morning, Heather thought about yesterday's situation. The ointment was needed to treat the wounds, but it didn't matter. What was really important was the Duke. In the darkness, the girl couldn't see everything. But she was sure that the skin on his face and neck was glowing. It looked like scales to her. Was the Duke really a monster? Even if he was, Heather was willing to accept him as such. And if he didn't hurt anyone, she didn't care either. The wary girl tried to calm down and not rush into decisions. And finally, she and the Duke were officially husband and wife. The lady came to continue working on the garden. There she saw strangers. The girl approached and asked what they were doing at the estate. One of the men said that His Highness had sent them to help rebuild the garden. They could do all the hard work. Heather noticed that the men didn't look like the Duke's subordinates. Did he really not trust the lady and that she couldn't handle the garden? But she accepted the help and wanted to prove that she could do it. The work was in full swing. Everyone was making an effort. And finally, the garden was blooming with flowers. A week passed and the work in the garden was completed. Heather and the workers cleared the garden and planted flowers. They also redesigned the garden path. One day, Heather accidentally stumbled upon an argument between her subjects and intervened. She decided to reduce the salaries of those who were engaged in bullying. One evening, the lady sat and thought about how not to be a freeloader for the Duke. She decided to study the local laws and learn more about the East. The girl found the duchy's records that Gilliam had given her. They showed a coat of arms in the form of a dragon with a pearl in its mouth. The dragon is a mystical creature, but for the Bernia Empire it had a mystical meaning. Its history is closely connected with dragons. They have played an important role since the beginning of its existence. They are also often mentioned in stories. According to the stories, on a frozen and fog-shrouded land, the pioneers were met by a dragon. The great dragon wanted to help people, and with just one fiery breath he melted all the ice. And with a sweep of his wings he dispersed all the fog, so that people could finally build an empire there. Thanks to the dragon, the dead land turned into a fertile land, and on it people were able to build the present Bernia. Heather carefully examined the dragon in the records. She had heard rumors that the Duke's blood ran in his family, but no one could prove it. The current Duke never left the eastern lands, but everyone believed that he was a descendant of the dragon, and therefore no one claims his lands. No one knew the truth anyway. Heather decided to rest and made the bed. She was alerted by strange sounds from the hallway. Those people whispered and tried to keep quiet. They were deciding what to do with the bad girl. The lady guessed with fear that they were heading towards her chambers. She thought she was completely safe in her room. The heathens sauntered into the chambers while the lady slept, hoping to have some good fun. Frightened, Heather quickly found cover and sat there quietly. They entered the room and were surprised to find the bed empty. The offenders hoped that the lady could not have gone far and decided to inspect the rooms. The search continued and they began to threaten. What they would do to her was something the terrible Duke had never dreamed of. The pagans noticed that her pantry had not been inspected, and they approached her. The lady sat trembling and trying not to scream. She was very afraid, thinking only about them not finding her. Suddenly, incomprehensible screams were heard in the room, and then one of the abusers begged for mercy. And after her words there was a sharp sound and a dead silence. Frightened Heather could not understand what had happened, and finally she decided to come out of hiding. When she opened the door, the Duke was standing in front of her. He asked how the girl was feeling. Heather was surprised to see him and his face. He came closer. took her hands gently and introduced himself as Cassian Eckerd. The Duke was in a large, moonlit conservatory, enjoying the coolness of the water that surrounded him from head to toe. The butler came to him and brought his clothes. He noticed that the master's body had regained its former appearance. Gilliam asked about the Duke's willingness to meet with Heather. After all, she had asked to meet with him again, but the butler naturally told her that the gentleman had left. He also warned Cassian that if this continued, misunderstandings would arise. The saddened Duke thought that the lady already hated him. Gilliam remained silent and thought that it was not worth starting this conversation, and it was hard for him to watch the Duke suffer. Gilliam insisted that the Lord clarify his relationship with the lady. He felt that she was a good person and would understand the Duke. If he hesitated any longer, he might regret it later. Cassian agreed with the butler. He decided to start with a conversation. The man hoped that Heather would not notice him that evening, and when the lady had become a duchess, Gilliam cautiously hinted to the Duke. It was necessary to pay more attention to the estate's budget. Cassian thought about it. The gentleman and lady met under unpleasant circumstances, so the butler thought that she could gradually change him. The Duke could not stay long in the mansion. Soon he had to go hunting. The Duke began to prepare his sword with a gilded handle. A quiet, starry night reigned over the estate. The Duke walked along the wide, quiet corridor. He wanted to meet Heather before she fell asleep. As Cassian approached her room, he heard voices. They were coming from Heather's room, and he intervened. The frightened girl did not take her eyes off the Duke. Suddenly, she stumbled and almost fell. She was caught by Cassian's strong hands. His face was very close. Lady couldn't understand why her heart was beating fast and her hands were very warm. And she also gasped when his lips almost touched hers. The girl was overcome by strange feelings and she didn't understand what was happening. Suddenly embarrassed, the Duke turned away from the girl and began to apologize and blame himself. He put his coat on Heather. He also assured her that nothing was in danger now, and he didn't want to say what happened to the perpetrators so that the lady wouldn't be upset. Cassian suggested taking the girl to the living room and asking her to close her eyes. Heather's heart wouldn't stop beating wildly, and she didn't know why. Passing the dark corridor, they came to the drawing room. Heather was grateful to the Duke for saving her. The Duke hastened to inform the lady of his departure, and he began to think about where the girl would spend the night. After all, her room was not suitable for rest. The Duke offered his bedroom. The lady was amazed. He explained that all the rooms were taken. The girl couldn't believe that there were no free rooms in such a large mansion. But this was a chance to talk to him. Unlike other people, married noblemen stayed in the bedroom for the night for carnal pleasures. The girl agreed, not knowing what the future held for them. And it's better to show the Duke now that she's on his side. The man noticed that the boss lady was confused. He picked her up again to carry her to the bedroom. When they entered the room, Cassian carefully placed the girl on the bed. Heather felt a strange atmosphere, as if something was about to happen. The man touched the lady's face and said goodnight and left. Heather was shocked and unhappy with his behavior. She certainly didn't expect much from him, but to cut it off so abruptly. After everything that had happened, the Duke could have shown at least a little attention. Everything happened just as Gilliam said. The girl didn't understand why. Could it be that nothing would change in the future? The next morning, the sky was dark and raining. Heather woke up having been troubled by nightmares all night. She saw a thick fog in the window and now she understood what the weather was like there all year round. Gina was already waiting for her outside the door. She entered the room and asked how the lady slept. Because she had woken up from a terrible thunderstorm. And because of the heavy rains, there was a thick fog by this time. And the assistant was extremely surprised that the lady ended up in the Duke's room. But Heather, upset, said that they had nothing, but abruptly changed the subject, saying that she simply wanted to know what the Duke's bedroom was like. The butler knocked on the door. Gina bowed and left them. A confused Gilliam learned from the Duke about the night's events. He was concerned about whether the lady was okay. Heather shared that it had left her a little shaken. The butler began to blame himself for what had happened. He also thanked the lady who had arranged the garden. After the death of the Duke's parents, the garden had fallen into disrepair, but the lady was able to restore it to its former state. Gilliam guaranteed that he would strengthen the security and replace all the staff for the lady's safety, and asked not to leave the Duke. That incident reminded Heather that one should never let one's guard down, and she reassured the butler that she had no intention of leaving. Gilliam thanked the lady for her kindness and promised to prepare another room for her. But Heather wondered where the Duke himself slept. The butler smiled and said that his lordship was sleeping in the living room, and wondered if the situation outside the window must have surprised the girl. She had never seen such thick fog before, and now she knew that the weather was always like this there. Because of this curtain, she could not see the outline of the garden from the window. Now it was clear that no one was taking care of him because of this. The butler called the lady to breakfast. In the dining room, the Duke and lady were sitting at a large, long table. Heather, embarrassed, asked how he had slept. He gave a short coo in response. She thanked Cassian for lending her his bedroom for the night. The girl noticed the mysterious sapphire eyes and slightly pale skin. The lady couldn't understand why just looking at him made her heart skip a beat, and she didn't understand what was happening to her. The cook brought the girl breakfast. She was surprised that Walton was not working that day. The food did not look very good and there was an unusual smell. Heather didn't understand their cuisine. It didn't matter how the dish looked, it mattered how it tasted. And she forced herself to try it. But the taste didn't help there. The food had a horrible smell. And what kind of disgusting food was this? And why was the Duke looking at it like that? Was he teasing her or maybe mocking her? Angry and hungry, Heather didn't understand what was happening at all. The entire mansion was enveloped in darkness and deafening silence. The little boy tried to call out to his mother. There was only dead silence in response. He entered his parents' room. The boy turned pale from what he saw. His parents were lying dead on the floor, having left the world in eternal embrace. The Duke was left without parents when he was still very young. Then he lost the meaning of life and was ready to give up. But the curse passed on to him. As a result, the boy had to become Duke Eckerd himself. And all of that was enough to break him. The endless rains continued to pour down like buckets. The Duke had been guarding the door until dawn and was very tired. Of course, no one would have dared to show up that night. No one could have imagined that the Duke's men would do such a thing to a lady. The butler also had no suspicions. The Duke assured Gilliam that he was not at fault. His main task was to manage the estate. The Duke had not foreseen that the estate's security would be so unreliable. Cassian firmly decided that he had to change everything. And first of all, he wanted to take care of the mansion's staff. The rain was drenching the bright flowers that had been planted. Heather was watching the weather out the window. She had planned to go for a walk. The girl heard the assistants longing for the good old days. The lady decided to continue the conversation, but ended up scaring them. Heather wanted to give them a break due to the weather. The helpers assured her that they were used to it and continued working. The sad lady wished for the rain to stop. Suddenly, the rain began to subside and the clouds dispersed, and a bright sun appeared. The girl did not expect to see such a thing. The servants could not believe their eyes either. They told the lady that she could change the weather. Heather denied it all and called it a coincidence. Suddenly they started talking about the curse of the lost treasure that had finally lifted. The lady could not understand what legend they were talking about. The assistants began to tell about an old existing story, who said that the sun would shine on the forgotten lands when the dragon of the east returned his treasure. The lady kept saying that it was just a coincidence. And when the weather changed, the lady wanted to go for a walk, and she ordered the crew to be prepared. The carriage was ready and waiting for Heather. When she got in, she was stunned. She didn't understand what the Duke was doing there. The serious man said that he had some business to attend to, and this was the only carriage that was ready, so he was going with it. The girl was embarrassed to go along, but still they rode alone. They were both uncomfortable and kept silent the whole way. Soon the Duke announced that they had arrived at the place. He was the first to come out and help the lady, offering his hand. But the Duke was not going to leave Heather. The girl reminded him that he had business. Cassian calmly replied that he had time he wanted to spend with his wife. He promised Gilliam that he would spend the lady with him. The couple walked together through the streets of the old town. The ancient buildings with their pointed roofs and small windows emphasized the cozy atmosphere. There was no one around. There was a notice on the door of one of the shops announcing a day off. Heather was really annoyed by their holiday because of the sun. Cassian explained that people had gone to rest because of the clear weather. After all, the sun is rare in these parts. The girl was upset that all the shops might be closed. Still, they managed to find an open seed shop. The girl asked where everyone was. Suddenly, they were met by a strange man who was happy to see the customers. The man noticed that as soon as the sun came out, people started to be interested in the flowers. He asked what kind of seeds the lady was looking for. Heather wanted something different, and the salesperson invited her to the full counter. He began showing her seeds and fertilizers. The lady noticed that due to the climate and low demand, everything was much more expensive than in the capital, and she tried to choose only those flowers that suited her. Suddenly their conversation was interrupted by the sharp clink of coins in a bag. The Duke apologized and asked how much the whole store had cost. Cassian seriously asked how much the shop cost and was ready to pay any amount. The lady tried to stop the Duke. He explained that if he bought the whole store, the lady wouldn't have to think about what to get. Heather was disappointed by the logic of the rich. The girl didn't want him to do that, and she didn't want to manipulate and influence his affairs. Heather understood his desire to spend his money as he pleased. The Duke claimed that the lady had every right to interfere in his affairs. The girl was surprised that the man was willing to buy a shop for her. On the other hand, she suggested spending money on concluding a deal so that the store would supply seeds at a lower price. Heather thought it was a good idea. She asked if the seller would be willing to sell them at a lower price. The man felt confused. He asked how many they wanted to buy. To begin with, the lady only wanted 10 of each kind. The salesman had not expected so many. Heather wanted to plant a lot of plants because of the nice weather. The seller imagined that when everything bloomed, it would be very beautiful. Finally, they proceeded to sign the contract. Suddenly, a robber burst into the shop and stole a bag of coins. The shopkeeper got angry and ran after him. He had already caught him on the street and started choking and cursing him. People began to gather around and shout to stop the fight on such a clear day. They were called drunkards and they were fighting again because of drinking. After these accusations, the quarrel only intensified, but with new people. The stunned couple stood watching the misunderstanding. Heather couldn't understand what was even happening. The saddened Duke explained that people in the East often behaved like this. They approached the local fair where there were many people. The girl asked the Duke if he had time to go with her to the bookstore. He didn't mind at all because he had the day off. The surprised lady thought that he did not like all this. But Cassian walked so patiently with her. And again their walk was interrupted by some noise. A man stood on the edge of the bridge, screaming frantically that he was going to jump into the river. The doctor's assistants ran after him and tried to take him back to the asylum. The embarrassed Duke watched in silence. Heather remembered her brother telling her that people in the East often suffered from depression due to the constant bad weather, and the high crime rate is due to very weak security. But she didn't think everything was so neglected. The upset Duke apologized for everything they saw, but Heather assured him that he didn't need to apologize. Then she remembered that the East was under his control and smiled modestly. She consoled the Duke that together they would improve life in the East. And they headed to the bookstore. The lady was choosing books and Cassian followed her, not taking his eyes off her. She chose and bought the books and thought that was enough for her for now. When they left the shop, Heather asked where they were going next. The Duke didn't think long and suggested somewhere to eat, and the lady didn't refuse. Cassian took the girl to a cozy restaurant. The lady looked at the menu and did not know or understand anything there. The Duke asked if she had chosen anything yet. Heather admitted that she knew nothing about the local cuisine, and asked him to order her favorite dish. The man studied the menu intently. The girl looked at him and thought about his calm voice, which was pleasant to listen to. She could not believe that this man was really her fiancé. Cassian noticed how the lady did not take her big eyes off him, and he asked if she might want something else. The girl blushed and asked not to pay attention. After a while, their food was brought to them. Heather hurried to try the unfamiliar food. When she looked at the plate, she didn't like it very much. Was this really his favorite dish? The lady tried to calm down and try it. It must have tasted delicious. Heather put a piece in her mouth and couldn't even chew or swallow it. She didn't like it that much, and Cassian noticed, surprised. The girl began to apologize for being rude and said that she couldn't eat it. The Duke was shocked, but he quickly calmed down and offered to order something else. Heather refused and just sat drinking fruit juice. The Duke looked very excited. They both sat in silence. At the next table, a group of young people were talking loudly. They were enjoying the sun, which made life better. Heather thought that people there seemed happier in clear weather. One of the men couldn't believe the beautiful weather for a long time and pinched himself. The boys wished that the sun would shine every day. One of them said that it would be so if it weren't for the Duke. Because of him, eternal terror reigned. Heather couldn't understand what was going on. But then she heard that all the eastern lands were cursed because of Duke Eckerd. They continued to talk nonsense. They claimed that nothing good should be expected from the Duke. The men felt a shudder from the fact that a monster was ruling them, and they wanted to see him at least once. He was so ugly. Heather looked at the Duke with pity. He had heard all this and had not reacted. In his eyes she saw sadness and despair. Those men hoped they would never encounter the Duke. and they continued to gossip about his marriage. They couldn't understand why a lady from the capital married a duke from the east. If she agreed to marry a monster, then her family was in great trouble. None of the wealthy families would allow the girl to travel so far. Heather could no longer listen to their statements. The irritated lady abruptly got up from the table. Cassian asked what happened. She said she didn't want to be there anymore and wanted to go home. The guys noticed the nervous lady and did not understand what had happened. The couple immediately left the establishment and headed for the carriage. On the way home, Heather felt sorry for her behavior. She asked the Duke for forgiveness. He reassured the lady that he was already used to such treatment. Lady thought it was a good decision to leave. At first, Cassian was reluctant to talk about what had happened, but they grew closer anyway. The sun was setting behind the horizon. The couple arrived at the estate. Heather sincerely thanked the Duke for the walk. He was also happy with her. Suddenly, he remembered that he had bought a gift. Cassian shyly handed the girl a candlestick. He said that it would be an alternative weapon for protection. Heather hadn't expected such concern from him and was grateful. They wished each other a good rest and went to their rooms. The girl carefully examined her gift. The candlestick didn't fit the interior, but she left it in a prominent place. Lady remembered that she hadn't spoken to her family in a long time and decided to write to them. She started writing to her dear father and brother. She was worried about how they were eating without her and if things were going well. She was worried about Raiden, who might have done something after she left. Heather promised she would find a way to pay off all their debts as soon as she could. She was so tired that her eyes closed on their own. Very late, Cassian found the lady asleep at the table. He quietly approached her and gently stroked her hair. The confused Duke didn't know what to say to her. He was afraid of hurting her and didn't know how to make the girl happy. But of one thing he was sure: his heart belonged to her. Under her hand he saw a letter and took it to read. The next morning, Raiden was furious at his estate. He thought Heather had taken him for a fool. If only Eckerd had proposed later. The guy was tearing his hair out and thinking. Like a monster who didn't show himself, he met a girl. She had never been to the east. But suddenly he remembered the debt and wanted to remind Heather's family and ordered the carriage to be prepared. Suddenly, another stunned assistant burst into the office. He reported a dozen carriages lined up in front of the estate. The guide said they had come to pay off a debt owed by the Duke of Argent. Raiden was stunned by the news. He looked out the window and saw that there were many of them there. The arrogant brute was not upset that they had come from the east. Heather slept all night at the table. When she woke up and saw that there was a blanket on her, she didn't remember falling asleep covered. Did someone really come into the room? The hungry lady remembered that she hadn't eaten anything since yesterday. She went to get ready to go down for breakfast. Heather met Walton at the entrance to the kitchen. She thought he had quit. The guy said he was taking the weekend off due to the birth of a child. The lady congratulated the cook on the new addition to the family. The guy felt a little embarrassed and quickly ran to prepare breakfast for the lady. Finally, she was served a normal meal. The hungry girl pounced on the delicious dish. The guy was surprised by the lady's behavior. Heather asked Walton if he asked the butler for permission to go outside the estate. It turned out that the servants decided such matters themselves. The lady was shocked by their activism, but the guy didn't see anything strange in it. It turned out that the problems with the staff were much more serious. Heather decided that everything needed to change. She ate a delicious meal and went upstairs. In the hall, she heard the servants gossiping about having seen the Duke's face. He didn't seem as scary as the rumors claimed. One of the girls saw him from afar. He was as beautiful as a sculpture. The other did not believe it because a servant had recently seen him and fainted. According to the unfortunate man, the Duke was a monster. Heather was tired of hearing this stupid gossip. She hoped she would soon hire new staff and tell them to keep their mouths shut so there would be no rumors. But it wasn't just that. The financial wisdom of His Grace, which Heather saw, was very disturbing, and she decided to check everything out. It was to her that Gilliam himself, whom she needed, was heading. The lady asked about the Duke's accountant, who controlled the castle's expenses. The lady wanted to see the ledger. The butler agreed to take Heather to his office. In the office, they were met by an arrogant man. With shouting and arguing, the girl managed to tear the book away from him. She just wanted to look at the expenses that had almost caused them a fight. In the evening, Heather sat down to look through the book. She was shocked by the incorrect data. Only descriptions of goods and a lot of furniture were recorded. After all, every business transaction must be reflected according to the double-entry principle. This is how all property transactions should be conducted. The accountant said he was overseeing the castle's finances. It seemed as if he was really just looking at them. He was also angry that they weren't telling him what to do. Heather didn't want to believe those false and incomprehensible records. She decided to check everything herself and write all the records anew. 3 days later, the lady went through the entire ledger and went to the treasurer. She went into the office of the busy man who was in charge of the Duke's finances. She told him that she would take over all the finances. He didn't understand anything. The lady put her ledger on the table with notes that weren't in the previous one. The man kept making excuses, which angered Heather. Realizing his mistake, he began to beg for mercy. The lady ordered him to return everything he had stolen, because stealing from the Duke was punishable by death. And if he told about his accomplices, she would mitigate the punishment. She took a thick book from the shelf and began to carefully leaf through the pages. She found it and showed it to the treasurer so that he would learn the basic principle of accounting well, where he used a clear example from everyday life. The lady left him and said goodbye. Heather kept flipping through the notebook. She hadn't expected so many people to be involved. It felt like a knife in the back. Before going to bed, the lady kept thinking that she had no idea that everything was so serious. That was more than enough to bring everything to naught. After all the problems she had been solving during the day, the girl felt unwell and decided to go for a walk. But she had to ask Gilliam for an escort. She went out into the corridor hoping to meet the butler, who should have arrived by now. But the Duke was already waiting for her. He had heard of the outing and wanted to keep her company. She had not expected to see his lordship in person so late. Cassian wondered if the girl would mind taking a walk together. The vast starry sky stretched over the luxurious estate. It was very dark in the courtyard, and the Duke warned his grandmother to be vigilant. They walked along the paths in the garden and were silent. Heather was thinking about how to break this awkward silence. Suddenly they began to speak to each other in unison. Cassian insisted that the lady speak first. She wanted to know if he had already found out about the situation with the accountant. Also, that there were many other people involved. The girl didn't want to talk about what had happened. They could have turned a blind eye to it, but Heather didn't want to do that. The Duke listened to her carefully and told her to do as she saw fit. He was afraid of letting the lady down, because everything had happened because of his negligence. Heather was touched by his answer, and he added that if anyone objected, she should contact him. It reassured the child that he was on her side. She remembered that Cassian had something to say too. The saddened Duke announced that he would be leaving the mansion for a few days. The hunting season had opened. He claimed that participation in this event was mandatory for him. The lady smiled and was happy. Something delicious would be prepared from the hunted game. Cassian approached the lady to straighten the shawl that had fallen from her snow-white shoulders. He said that it was getting cold and they should be back. The next morning, all the subordinates were waiting in the hall. They had no idea why they had been gathered so early. The lady's stern voice came from the mountain. Heather asked if everyone was gathered. She asked everyone to listen carefully to what she had to say. The lady announced that from the next day they would all be off work. They didn't understand what the lady meant. She thought she should have explained it more clearly. Heather repeated, "Either they return everything they stole or they leave." The choice was theirs. And if someone didn't like something, she was waiting for a conversation. But if they lied, it wouldn't end with just being fired. None of them wanted to reflect on their behavior. Heather could see the resentment in their eyes. The subordinates began to express their dissatisfaction. They did not believe that the girl had accepted the title of mistress of this estate. After all, the newlyweds did not hold a wedding ceremony and thought that no one knew about it. They did not consider her their mistress. They only recognized the Duke. They needed proof of his lordship's approval of her self-government. Everyone shouted that she had no right to be a duchess. Cassian, furious, arrived at the scene. The assistants did not recognize him. They whispered among themselves and asked him who he was. The butler began to shout at the impudent man to show respect to his grace, the Duke. Cassian kept his stern, cold gaze on them. Heather was pleasantly surprised and hadn't expected to see him. The servants were astonished when they found out who was in front of them. The stern Duke called the guards. The subordinates were frightened and fell to their knees before him and begged for mercy. Cassian did not want to listen to them and ordered them to be locked up and the warden to report on their behavior. And for any violation, he threatened all the guards. The Duke went up to the terrace to Heather. She was as beautiful as ever. He called her his wife, took her by the arm, and led her into the garden. In the blooming garden, they sat under an umbrella and talked. Cassian apologized for what had happened. The lady, on the other hand, thanked him for his help. The Duke considered changing the staff, But Heather objected and wanted to leave everything as it was. The husband was surprised by his wife's decision. Some of those people had no idea how to serve on the estate. Considering this case, the lady thought she would pay more attention to the people who remained, so that they would take the lady's side. She smiled because she had a lot of work to do. And suddenly she remembered that the Duke was leaving soon. So the girl prepared something for him. In her hands she held a handkerchief embroidered with gold threads. Kazian was surprised that she had given him a gift. The girl explained that she wanted to give something more valuable, but she thought that another thing could only interfere with the hunt. That's why it was such a simple gift. The gently embarrassed Duke looked excited. He thanked her grace. Heather looked at him with a look of warmth, and in a gentle voice she told the Duke to take care of himself on the hunt. With trembling in her voice she said that she would eagerly await his return. Thanks to that opportunity, the atmosphere in the castle changed significantly. Heather tried to improve the attitude of the remaining staff, also thanks to the efforts of Walton, who took on the training. And the biggest problem that was on the estate with food became more attractive and edible. Heather was sitting in her office thinking when they got their work system in place. Now they needed to hire more people for the areas where they needed them. Lady decided to take a break from paperwork. Thick fog was visible outside the window. Heather remembered that the hunt was supposed to start today. She replayed in her mind the day she had given him the handkerchief. He had seemed very upset to Heather. The girl began to worry after that. She hoped that he would return from the hunt safe and sound. In the forest surrounded by fog was the Duke. He held his mighty sword in his hands. Cassian was not alone but with assistants. They all bravely repelled the attack of huge white wolves. There was really no end in sight for them. The wolves were getting more and more numerous. But the men did not give up and continued the fierce battle. One of the assistants reported that they had finally finished in the west and east. The Grand Duke stood in his armor. He praised his assistants for their excellent work, and decided that they would spend the night in that very place. The Duke sat by the fire. While no one was looking, he took out Heather's gift. The handkerchief reminded him of her. Suddenly, an assistant came up and reported the fog. Since the sun appeared in the east, the speed of the fog's spread has slowed significantly. The boy hoped that they would finish the hunt in a week, but Kazian was categorical. He mysteriously said that he would give only 4 days. The guys were very indignant. They would never have time to finish everything in such a short time, and even have time to go back. The Duke did not seem angry, but rather calm and mysterious. He explained that this time he had promised to return early. In the majestic imperial palace over which thick black clouds had gathered, a tall blonde man sat on the throne. It was Vandian Ahad Bernia, the Emperor of Bernia. He kept thinking about the Duke, who in his opinion had sunk to the bottom. But the Emperor did not expect him to marry. And not just anyone, but a family that had gone bankrupt. Vandian never understood what was going on in the Duke's mind. The man hoped that the boy would become wiser after seeing his parents murdered. But this marriage and everything else did not please the Emperor. It was as if Cassian wanted to rise above and no longer remain a mere spectator. The Emperor looked at the letter with hatred and laughed that the Duke was considered a descendant of a dragon. Vandian saw him as nothing more than a brainless idiot. The Emperor called the assistant Hofmeister and ordered him to send a letter to Eckhard. In the letter, he was to write an invitation to the Duke. Cassian was to arrive in the capital with his wife. Vandian had not seen the Duke for a long time and was anxious to see him and his wife. Heather was returning from the reception, exhausted. She looked gorgeous in her flowing lavender dress. The day had seemed too hard for her. The girl learned some information from the Eastern nobility at the tea ceremony, and Heather roughly understood how the upper society was organized. She was angry and disappointed at the same time. The visit seemed to her like an exhausting ordeal, but it was worth it. The lady rode in the carriage, looking out the window at the bright orange sky. The sun was already setting, and Heather couldn't stop thinking about the Duke's return. 4 long days passed. Suddenly, the assistant announced that they had arrived. The lady did not expect him to speak so abruptly and was frightened. Gilliam opened the carriage door and helped the lady out. The exhausted girl tried to see what was in front of the mansion. She was very angry. There was a mountain of game lying right in front of the entrance. The Duke came out to greet his wife. She did not expect to see him. The lady couldn't understand why he was staring at her and didn't look up. She waited for an explanation of what it was and why it was lying in the middle of the estate. Cassian calmly told her about the game, which his wife had asked for herself. Heather calmed down and said awkwardly that she didn't think there would be so much. The lady suggested they go inside. They walked down the wide, spacious corridor. Heather wanted the Duke to take the time to talk. He agreed and invited her into his office. Heather had never been there before and was curious to see. She smiled coquettishly and didn't object. The girl found herself in a large office where the walls were literally covered with books and documents. She was amazed by the scale of the information collected. It wasn't likely because of the library, but Heather found the atmosphere a little gloomy. She continued to look around with admiration. The Duke was perusing something on the shelf and suddenly turned to the lady. Cassian knew she was at a reception and asked about her impressions. Heather assured that she enjoyed it much more than she expected, despite the fact that everyone got into a bit of a fight at the end. The lady also confidently replied that she had a great time, because she hadn't talked to anyone for a long time and understood how to behave in Eastern society. The girl almost forgot to ask her husband how the hunt had gone, but Cassian remained silent in response. For a while they were both silent, but the girl was persistent. She did not want to seem too talkative to the Duke and suggested that he tell his lordship about the trip, but he reluctantly continued the conversation and insisted that it wasn't a very interesting story. Heather wouldn't shut up and wanted to know all the details. Were his soldiers there? That is, she meant all those who went with him. The Duke corrected her, saying that those people were helping him. The lady bowed her head and understood that he did not want to tell, and he probably meant that these soldiers did not belong to him. Heather didn't know how to ask something. Now that they were together like this, she finally dared. She asked Cassian cautiously. Could she ask the question that had been bothering her for a long time? The Duke assured her that he had listened attentively. She wondered how he had found out about her. It also seemed to the girl that they had never met before their engagement. She also assumed that they might have once crossed paths at a reception in the capital. Cassian denied everything his wife had said. He approached her closer and said that their first meeting had taken place at the estate. As the Duke spoke these words, he didn't notice that he had taken Heather's hands. He abruptly let go and began to apologize. The lady felt uncomfortable and started laughing. So they had never met before. She found it all strange and his answer untrue. It was already very late and the Duke offered to show the lady to her chambers. She was grateful for his concern. Cassian remained in his study, standing in front of his library. He was thinking seriously about something. Suddenly the butler arrived. He asked his lordship what he should do with the loot, which lay in a mountain right in front of the castle. The Duke ordered them to leave everything. Gilliam asked again if they should have left everything. He wondered why they needed so much game. The Duke spoke angrily. He spoke sternly to him. It was all because Heather had ordered it. The confused butler had to think about how to place that mountain in the mansion. The next morning, Gilliam arrived at the Duke's office with the day's reports. He also asked about his lordship's insomnia. Cassian slept almost soundly. The butler was sincerely glad for the Duke because before he had been troubled by terrible nightmares that kept him awake. The Duke had noticed their absence since Heather had arrived at the estate. He had been dreaming of getting closer to her, and that would have been a great thing. Gilliam remembered the mail, which contained the results of the personnel trial, invitations to banquets, and tickets to the performance from several theaters. The Duke had an idea and asked for them. The butler did not understand his lordship. Cassian meant theater tickets. Heather was in her chambers, overwhelmed by the invitation to the theater and the mountains of gifts. She was delighted to see what was in the beautiful boxes. It seemed to her that there were a lot of clothes donated. Lady looked closely at the dresses with Gina and didn't know what to wear. The assistant noticed that the style and cut of the dress was different from what the lady was wearing. Oriental dresses are more decorated and much shorter. Heather hoped that dresses like this were in fashion right now, because it was raining heavily in the east. It might not be very comfortable to wear, but it was a gift from His Grace. He had prepared it personally for her, so she had to wear it. Heather scrutinized herself in the mirror and asked Jenna about her appearance, thinking the dress was too fancy for the theater. The lady was already thinking of putting on another dress when suddenly the Duke's voice was heard. He entered his wife's room. Heather was embarrassed by his appearance, but he apologized. Cassian claimed that he called out to the lady, but she did not answer. The girl asked the Duke about her strange appearance. Cassian reassured the lady and said that she looked stunned. Confused, Heather didn't expect such a confident answer from him. The Duke suggested complementing the look with an accessory. The lady agreed and relied on her husband's taste. Cassian did not expect this and chose a suitable item that emphasized the lady's image. Heather looked at the hat the Duke had chosen. She thought she was too dressed up. Cassian assured her that everything suited her very well. The man looked at his watch and remembered that they had to hurry. The performance was about to start, and gallantly took his wife's arm. The couple arrived at the local theater. There were many people around, also hurrying to the performance. They climbed the wide stairs and headed into the hall to take their seats. There were already many people waiting in the hall. Heather and the Duke stood at the entrance, looking around. To the girl, everything seemed surprisingly lively. Finally, they took their seats. Cassian informed the lady that he had taken the liberty of familiarizing himself with the plot of the play they would be watching. He thought it would be better if it was a family play. But unfortunately, this genre was not very popular in the East. The Duke excitedly said that this play was about revenge. The lady was confused and hoped that the play would not be scary. She couldn't understand how he knew she liked family plays. The lady didn't seem to mention it. The performance began and everyone began to listen attentively. An intriguing game of a young couple unfolded on stage, and it seemed that every smile and every look they gave was a carefully rehearsed role in a grand theatrical production. Heather was watching the performance with delight. Out of nowhere, a man on stage behaved rudely and slapped the girl on the cheek. The lady had never seen anything like it before, and she was both confused and frightened. Suddenly, she felt the Duke's hand holding hers. The lady glanced at him furtively and did not understand why he had been holding her hand. The Duke gave no sign and watched the play attentively. Heather wondered if he really needed to hold on to something when the shocking action was taking place on stage. She was confused and didn't know what to do. Because of Cassian's touches, the embarrassed girl could not concentrate on the performance. The actors lined up and sang the closing song. The play came to an end and they politely bowed and thanked the audience. There was thunderous applause from the audience. Heather was unhappy that she had missed everything that happened in the second act. The sad lady had not been to the theater for a long time, but she really liked the great work done by the actors, and their acting seemed quite lively. Cassian asked the lady if she had enjoyed the performance. Of course it wasn't something she enjoyed, but Heather was pleased. She smiled and liked how the actors really worked well on their acting. By chance, the main character of the play overheard their conversation. The girl was proud to have received praise from the Duchess herself. It was the actress who had been hit by the hero of the play. Heather was worried about her cheek. The girl assured her that it didn't hurt for the sake of art. The actress's partner also came up and thanked the lady for decorating their theater with her presence. The lady expressed her delight and that she was able to immerse herself in the play. The young man took the lady's hands and with a smile thanked her for the compliments from the beautiful Duchess. He hoped the lady would attend their next production. Heather awkwardly thanked him for the invitation. To Heather, he seemed too energetic, his hands gripping hers tightly. The dissatisfied Duke took the boy by the shoulder to move him away from the lady, and with a stern look he informed him that he was too close. Heather did not like what was happening between the men. The guy was scared like a hare before a bull, asked him to forgive him, and quickly left the couple alone. Cassian kept calling Heather his wife. He suggested they leave early before too many people arrived. The lady did not contradict the Duke and they went out. When they were heading to their carriage, people had already gathered there. They guessed that it was Duke Eckerd's carriage, and they could not believe that His Highness had arrived for the performance. Heather noticed that there were too many people to get through. She didn't know what to do. After a short pause, the Duke said they would wait, and in his opinion, this was the best option. The girl remembered the butler's words that it was dangerous to walk at night. Cassian knew it was dangerous, but the area was lively, so it was relatively safe. And besides, they were accompanied by knights, so there was no need to worry. Heather was surprised by the escort. The Duke had guaranteed that they would follow them secretly and not stand out from the crowd. Cassian was worried that his wife was hungry. It was late and Heather thought all the restaurants were closed, and it was unlikely she would be able to eat anything there. The Duke offered his hand and suggested visiting a certain place, and he asked his wife if she would mind. Without hesitation, the lady offered him her hand and readily agreed. They arrived at the fast food trailer. They were greeted by a friendly lady who said that everything was sorted out instantly. The lady greeted them and looked at everything with doubt. Cassian ordered 2 skewers of fried shrimp. Heather, at first glance, thought it looked very appetizing, and he also asked not to pour the sauce on it. But the kind lady insisted that it would be much tastier that way. The Duke refused anyway and took his order. Cassian offered his wife a snack, but for some reason she looked at him and remained silent. Maybe she didn't like shrimp more. Heather was acting mysteriously. The confused Duke thought she would enjoy them. The blushing lady said she loved them very much, He had simply ordered 2 skewers for her, but one of her hands was busy. The Duke did not notice how he held it. He quickly withdrew his hand and handed over the skewers. The lady held them and smelled the delicious aroma, and hoped they tasted delicious too. When Heather tasted one, she was pleasantly surprised. She finally felt the pleasure of the taste and continued to eat quickly. The saleswoman was pleased to see that the girl really liked it. When Heather ate it all, she was very satisfied. Cassian offered to take more, but the lady had no room for another portion. The Duke watched with tenderness that he had finally pleased his wife. He thought that the people had already dispersed and they could return. It was already very late when they arrived at the estate. Cassian helped the lady up the stairs as it was very dark. Heather was delighted with the unusual piece, the shrimp from the stall. She told the Duke that it was all new to her. The girl sincerely thanked His Excellency for a truly good evening. He listened to her attentively and spoke in a pleasant voice, glad that the lady liked everything. The Duke did not take his eyes off her. Heather stared at him with her big green eyes and was silent. She was so mesmerized by his face that she couldn't say a word. There was barely a smile on his face, but she could already feel the emotions welling up inside her. He told his wife to rest. Heather hadn't understood why she'd been feeling this way for days. And until now, she'd blamed it all on the good weather. Several days had passed since then. Heather was resting in her chambers, thinking about the Duke all the time. He wouldn't leave her mind, and it was starting to make her angry. She looked in the mirror and saw that her cheeks were red. She was confused. Well, of course, who could resist such a beautiful face? She was also admiring it, she didn't realize it. Heather sat there holding her face in confusion, and she thought it was nonsense because they weren't even married. His Grace pursued his goal when he proposed to her. She was given some powers, but the wedding ceremony never took place. She was very confused about what this could mean, that his lordship did not want to get close to her. Therefore, the lady firmly decided that she should not feel any feelings. The girl began to worry that she had not seen the Duke for several days. Was he really that busy, and hoped that Cassian was at the mansion? Heather wanted to check for her own peace of mind and started her search from the library. But there was no one there. Perhaps he was in his office and she went to him. His voice was heard near the office door and the lady accidentally overheard the conversation. He was talking loudly about visiting the capital for a few days. Heather started knocking on the door. It was opened by a confused Cassian. Heather asked if she was distracting him from his work. The Duke invited his wife into his office. The girl noticed his overly warm clothing. It was getting warmer in the yard and he was so dressed up. Was he really that cold? And he was holding a golden envelope in his hands. Heather thought Cassian had been very busy lately. He said he had a lot of things to take care of. The lady understood him and asked if he had already left. The man had time and listened to her attentively. Confused, Heather wanted to discuss something else, but overheard him talking about the capital. Cassian was silent and didn't know how to report. The Duke said that the imperial family had sent them a letter. The lady could not believe that the message was really from the ruling family. They were inviting a young couple to the palace. Heather, excited, could not understand who they were talking about. Cassian repeated to his wife that they were expecting 2. The day of departure arrived. The weather was pleasant and sunny. The luggage carts were parked right in front of the entrance to the mansion. The helpers kept loading and carrying boxes. Heather wondered what kind of things they were carrying. The Duke assured her that it was his luggage. The lady was unhappy with so many things. Cassian announced that it was time to set off. The girl felt some strange anxiety. The carriage window offered an incredible view. The mountains were shrouded in golden clouds, and at the foot of the mountains lay a green forest. Jaina was filled with emotions about her imminent return to the capital. She could already imagine how everyone would envy her appearance. The assistant wanted to buy a souvenir for Charlotte, who worked with her, but she didn't know what to buy. Heather watched as she looked charmingly excited. Jaina didn't stop talking. She remembered how worried she had been when she first arrived in the capital. But the girl was very happy about the relationship between the lady and his lordship. Heather tried to keep the conversation going. The assistant hadn't expected the East to be so hospitable, and she honestly admitted that she only realized it now. Jaina hoped that the lady would marry that man after all. The lady could not understand who she meant. The assistant was surprised that Heather didn't remember the lady always telling her stories when Jenna was younger, but nothing came to the lady's mind. Jaina continued to remember with delight how the lady had told her about that gentleman before going to bed. The girl said with trepidation that she still remembered all the stories. They seemed to have just come out of the pages of a fascinating book. Heather couldn't calm down. She tried to remember. She really didn't understand what the assistant was talking about. The lady looked out the window and reassured herself. It must have been a not very important memory, which is why she had forgotten it. Evening was approaching and the sun was shining through the pink clouds. The Duke ordered a halt. Heather got out of the carriage and felt dizzy. Perhaps this feeling was due to the long journey. Cassian asked the lady how she was feeling. He said that there were still several days left to travel to the capital, as the capital was far from the eastern lands. He asked his wife how she felt about staying at Argent Castle while they were in the capital. Heather was confused. Could they really stay at her house? But the girl was a little worried about her brother and father. They were both knights and could be a bit rough. But the Duke didn't care. Heather was supposed to ask the Duke how they should behave in front of her family. She said they should show everyone how in love the couple was. The Duke was embarrassed and promised to try his best. The girl asked him to do his best. A few days later, the news of the lady's arrival reached the Argenta castle. It was already evening, and the father and son were sitting on the steps in front of the castle, looking at the entrance to the estate. They both couldn't believe that they would finally see their Heather. Had that long-awaited day finally come? Father and son waited patiently at the door of the mansion, their faces expressing a mixture of excitement and anticipation of the meeting. Cedric mentioned that he hadn't seen his sister for a long time, and his father admitted that he looked at her portrait every evening. He was afraid that he would forget what his daughter looked like. The son worried about what they would do if the Duke turned out to be a real monster. The worried father knew from her letters that everything was fine with her. But no one knew. The father assumed that Eckard had threatened his beloved daughter, and so she had no choice but to cover for him. The men discussed various scenarios for a long time. The son decided that if it turned out that Heather was experiencing even minor difficulties, they'll file for divorce in a moment. His father fully supported him, even though he'll have to work harder to pay off the debt, because Heather's happiness was their #1 priority. And they decided not to rush to conclusions and to see the Duke for themselves. Before sunset, the carriage arrived at the mansion. Cassian gallantly helped his wife out of the carriage. The girl was overjoyed to see her loved ones. She didn't expect them to be greeted with all the honors. The couple walked along the red carpet laid out to the very entrance to the mansion. The father was the first to throw himself into his daughter's arms. The men hugged their Heather tightly and could not hold back tears of joy. They talked about how sad and missed them. These tendernesses quickly ended when they saw the Duke. They did not know who Eckard was. The girl introduced him to His Grace the Duke. The men were pleasantly stunned. Cedric whispered in his father's ear about the blatantly false rumors. The father could not believe that the Duke was so attractive, and quickly began to bow to his lordship. Cassian ignored their behavior and politely thanked them for their warm welcome. Sebastian looked at their carts with things in surprise, and he wondered why they needed so many things. The Duke calmly replied that they were gifts for him and his father. Heather and her family were stunned, especially the lady he didn't inform. The men were embarrassed and started apologizing. Father and son greatly appreciated his kindness, but they could not accept so many gifts. The Duke looked sternly at his father and asked what he was supposed to take back. With this question, he forced the men to change their minds. Sebastian and his father hesitated for a long time, but still had to accept the gifts with joy. The father invited everyone to the mansion. After all, the journey had been long and difficult, and everyone was tired. The husband led the newlyweds to the rooms that had been prepared for them. Heather, without thinking, expressed her dissatisfaction that there was only one room. The father was not expecting this and asked what was wrong with his daughter. The girl could not admit to her father that she had not yet shared a bedroom with the Duke. Heather assured them that everything was fine, and said that they had been shaking in the carriage for a long time. If their father didn't mind, they wanted to rest. The father left the young couple. Heather smiled and asked the Duke if her family had confused him. But Cassian assured her that everything was fine. He noticed that her family had a very close and warm relationship. Heather assured the Duke that he would find many things uncomfortable during his stay at the mansion, even the fact that his father's estate is much smaller than his castle. Cassian reassured the lady. He even had enough space for them to stop. The girl was glad to hear that he was comfortable. He was worried that it would be uncomfortable to live in the same room, and suggested that they sleep separately. Heather assured him that this was not necessary. Although it was a bit cramped, Heather hoped they could take care of each other while they lived in the capital. Cassian and his wife stood silent in the middle of their room. The lady waited for him to say something else. Suddenly, Gina burst into the room and announced dinner. But then she apologized because she didn't want to disturb them. They said she was just in time. A set table was already waiting in the spacious dining room. The food looked appetizing and varied. There were meat dishes, appetizers, and desserts. Heather wasn't feeling very well after the trip, and she didn't feel any better until dinner. The father invited everyone to a modest dinner. He made sure his daughter ate because he thought she had lost weight. The girl smiled and said that she had not had an appetite lately, but now she was at home and would try to eat well. She tried to eat at least a bite so that her brother and father wouldn't make a fuss. Lady thought about eating a few spoonfuls of soup, apologizing, and quickly returning to the room. As soon as she tasted the first spoonful, she felt sick. Cassian was concerned for the lady's well-being. Sebastian and his father were also very scared that the girl was sick. Heather assured them that it was nothing serious. The men began to ask the Duke what was happening to the girl. They accused him of neglecting his wife's health. Heather couldn't understand what they were getting at and tried to calm them down. Suddenly, Sebastian got up from the table and told his sister not to worry. He understood perfectly well what condition the girl was in. Heather knew her brother was wrong about his assumptions. She and the Duke had never even slept together. The father screamed furiously that he couldn't believe how indifferent her husband was. His only Heather was too soft-hearted. His daughter didn't say a word because she was afraid of causing problems for her loved ones. And yet she went through this. Suddenly, Heather screamed loudly that everything was wrong. Her family and husband looked at her in shock. The lady took a deep breath and said that she was not pregnant. The father tried to say something, but his daughter asked him to listen. She and his Grace were very busy, and the birth of an heir was not yet part of their plans. The father and son were shocked by what they heard. Their faces showed surprise and anxiety. They did not want to offend the Duke. The men bowed guiltily and apologized to him for their rudeness. Cassian reassured them that everything was fine and they didn't have to apologize. Heather sat there, confused and silent. The father, as the head of the family, suggested that the meal continue because all the dishes were getting cold. He asked the Duke how he liked their dishes. The Duke found everything delicious. The Oriental cuisine was a bit different. Father was pleasantly pleased to hear that. The men finished their dinner and kept their eyes on Cassian. They stood behind him waiting for him. The Duke didn't understand what they wanted. Heather didn't like it and asked her father what they were up to. He reassured his daughter that they only needed to talk to his lordship, and told her not to worry because they were sensible people. For Heather, this was no argument. Cassian stood up and agreed to step aside to talk. Lady was worried if everything was okay. The Duke asked his wife not to worry and ordered them to go to their chambers to rest. Heather, upset, finally returned home after a long time, but her worries only increased. The men went into their father's spacious office. They sat at a round table with snacks and wine. The father began the conversation with the debt that the Duke had taken on. Cassian did not object. Everything was exactly as it was. Argent the elder promised to return everything to the penny. He assured that his family did not sell Heather. Therefore, they could not accept such a large sum of money. Cassian dispelled her husband's worries. He paid off their family's debts, just because he didn't want to see Heather unhappy because of her problems. The Duke never even thought of wooing the girl with money. She came to him herself. Cassian told how he had settled with their borrower. He said that he had returned the money that his father had borrowed from the previous count to stop the spread of false information, so they had nothing to worry about. Argenta was surprised that the Duke had even thought ahead to avoid rumors. Instead, he asked him for a favor, that his lordship would allow them to return the sum the Duke had spent on them. Although it might not be soon, the father insisted on not refusing. Cassian did not object to his husband, as he had no other choice, and he asked that all this remain a secret from his wife. Argent had something else he wanted to ask his lordship. Cassian was ready to answer. The man was tormented by the question of why the Duke had chosen his daughter out of so many worthy ladies. Cassian thought for a moment. Then he said because it had to be her. They had already met, but if the father wanted to know why he proposed to her, he replied that Heather was all he had left for him. But she didn't remember anything, and that's why Cassian asked his family not to tell the girl the details of their conversation. Heather was taking a relaxing bath in her room. She sat and looked out the window at the starry sky. Lady wondered if they had really been talking for so long. With these thoughts, she couldn't calm down and enjoy the fragrant bath. Still, on the other hand, the situation that arose really caused a lot of misunderstanding, and it all only made the girl sad. She was so busy with work that she thought she and the Duke were only a couple in documents. The question of an heir simply flew out of her mind. The lady remembered and pondered everything. Cassian was being too polite to her, so much so that it embarrassed her a little. Although Heather was sure his kindness to her was unselfish, Lady was completely immersed in the bubble bath. Suddenly her peace was disturbed by the sound of the door opening into the room. The girl began to listen carefully, hoping that she had heard something. Hazel got out of the bath and threw a towel over herself. She thought it was Jenna and started calling her. Suddenly she saw the Duke in front of her. He was confused and did not know what to do next. Heather, in surprise, began to scream loudly throughout the mansion. The Duke, frightened by her scream, began to cover his face with his hands. He did not want to interrupt so much and apologized. Sebastian and his father came running at the sound of the scream. They were worried about Heather and thought that the Duke had done something to her. The angry girl said that his lordship had mistakenly entered the bathroom. So she screamed in surprise. This surprised the brother, because they were a couple. The father was glad that it was nothing serious, but he emphasized that he should definitely call him if something happened. The girl understood everything. After making sure that everything was fine, the men returned to their rooms. Heather had put on her nightgown and was sitting on the sofa. She invited the Duke to sit next to her. Embarrassed, Kazian sat down next to his wife at her request. An incomprehensible silence fell between them. The Duke didn't want to scare her because he wasn't familiar with the layout of the mansion. The husband did not find his wife in their chambers, and did not know that the other door would lead directly to the bathroom. Kazian apologized once again. Heather was already calm, and assured him that everything was fine. Of course, the Duke was confused and she apologized for shouting. The lady was concerned about his conversation with her family. She asked if his father and Cedric had put pressure on him. There was nothing like it, and the Duke liked their attitude. The lady was more than pleased. Heather asked the Duke about the gifts he had brought. Did he think it was too much? The saddened Kazian said that the gifts were truly from the heart. In Heather's opinion, it was enough to show his sincerity. And that's exactly what the man did, showing his honesty with his action. The lady was angry that she couldn't convince him that she was right. But the next time the girl insisted on telling her everything first. The husband completely agreed with his wife. He looked at her and noticed that her hair was wet. Kazian was worried that his wife would get sick if she went to bed with wet hair. The girl wanted to dry it as quickly as possible. The Duke held a towel in his hands and offered his help. The lady agreed without hesitation. His blue eyes were filled with admiration for her. He gently took each strand and dried it. The Duke noticed that her hair turned darker when it was wet. He liked it very much and continued to blow-dry it. After finishing with the hair, Kazian said it was time for bed, and they lay down to rest together. It had been a tough day for everyone, so it was important to get a good night's sleep. Heather was very nervous about going to sleep. She still couldn't close her eyes. She got up and started calling for the Duke. The husband was already fast asleep and did not hear his wife. The girl sat quietly and admired him. She could not understand what he was feeling. Why did he make the proposal and treat her with kindness, when he even refused to hold the wedding ceremony? The girl sat next to the Duke and thought about everything. He seemed so mysterious to her. The next fine morning, the carriage was waiting for the Duke outside the mansion. The handsome, black-haired man was ready to depart. Heather managed to see him off and escort him out. Cassian explained to the lady that she was not obligated to escort him out. Before he could finish, the girl hugged him tightly. She whispered in his ear that they should pretend to be a couple in love while they were in the capital. This was enough to show their love. The Duke had no choice but to agree with his wife. Heather had announced that they were having dinner together, and she wanted to make sure they ate together too. Heather wished her husband not to get tired and to take care of himself. He reciprocated by wishing his wife a good rest. The lady waved after him. Sebastian and his father came up to her, glad that the Duke had finally left. The girl turned around and saw them. She asked how long they had been with her. Heather knew that her brother was going to the palace. The boy wanted to spend more time with his sister, so he took time off. They didn't know when they would get another chance to see her, so they asked to let Heather spend time as a family. The girl was happy to hear that. Suddenly, a carriage pulled up to the mansion. Raiden got out of it, smiling defiantly. He called Heather and the Duke very brave for returning to the capital so quickly. With an evil look, he said that the Duke would pay for everything. Cassian was driving thoughtfully to the imperial palace. He carefully examined himself in the reflection in the window. His assistant announced his arrival. A luxurious carriage drawn by white horses stopped in front of the huge palace. The castle's tall towers and elegant architecture shone in the sun. Cassian got out of the carriage and looked around. And for a moment he imagined that nothing had changed at all during his absence. The Duke entered the great hall to the emperor. He bowed and announced his visit for an audience. An imperious blonde man with a lush fur collar sat on the throne. He hadn't seen the Duke for a long time. Van Dayon was not in a good relationship with the Duke to engage in social conversations, so he decided to get down to business right away.